I wanted to particularly emphasize your phrase of paradigmatic confusion as two groups arguing from incompatible epistemological bases. I think that's so prevalent today.
You see a nice example.
Right, yeah. I always think, when I hear that, I always think of the neo-Keynesians and the neoliberals, because they're talking about the same phenomenon from completely different bases of assumption, and they never challenge the assumptions. They always just argue back and forth. So I think that has great relevance for us when we come to the further topics of deep learning and how are we going to teach subjects.
Absolutely.
In fact, there is a movement among graduate students in economics in Europe today. Maybe it's in North America also, but I know it's quite prevalent in organized in different countries of Europe. Started in Germany, I think. But thousands and thousands of graduate students who are protesting the fact that whatever university they're in is teaching one paradigm for understanding economics. And the students come out thinking this is economics, like you've been to Chicago and you're learning the monetarist view. And they're protesting that and say, you've got to teach us that this is a relative perception, and there are an endless variety of versions of this. And so this is a movement away from the limits of the conceptual paradigm, and it's a very important thing for us in education. When you talked about biology, I thought of an experience I had about 10 years ago with a very eminent Indian biologist who happened to have worked with or known Watson and Crick, and was very proud of the fact that he had known Watson and Crick, who developed the structure of DNA. And though he came from an orthodox Brahmin community, which was supposed to be the heritage of Indian spirituality, he said, we are very close to being able to fully explain human consciousness and life and consciousness in material terms. And I was kind of surprised to hear that from an Indian Brahmin. And a little later in our discussion, he started talking about the fact he had founded an eminent scientific institution, and he was decrying the fact that the values on which the institution had been founded, that impersonal quest for truth, that love of integrity, and he used several words like that. And at one point I stopped him and said, he said, this is really the essence of science. Well, truth, integrity, are you going to find those in the genes? You're saying that the most important part of science is something that's completely is non-structural. It's completely a subjective valuation, and isn't what the heart of science is all about. I stopped short of that because I wanted to retain my working relationship with him. But I think it presents the dichotomy, why this subject is so important to us. When I was elected to the Academy 20 years ago, the president of the Academy was a very eminent thinker, Harlan Cleveland. He was a political scientist. He had worked in the Kennedy and Johnson administration and been president of a university. And back in the 1950s, he was working for the U.S. government in East Asia. And he noted a phenomenal change taking place, a social change, a rapid development in East Asia. And he was trying to study it and understand what's going on. What has happened to this place that suddenly it's changing so fast? And he came up with a phrase to describe it. It's a revolution of rising expectations. He was the inventor of that phrase. It later got into the book of quotations and has been widely used afterwards. And essentially what he was saying is that the single most important determining factor in social development is not resources. Japan doesn't have many. It's not money. The OPEC countries had tons of money. What they weren't changing very fast socially. They remained politically and economically. It is a subjective psychological factor. So it was interesting to me how you have interpreted this topic, because I was really eager for this topic to come up because of how important it is for the social sciences. We are still trying to teach most social science from as if we're talking about an objective reality. So Chandrasekharan's example of FDR, who finally got on the radio to the American people and he said, the real problem we have is fear. We have nothing to, his famous statement, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. He said he studied economics at Harvard and he didn't learn anything that could help him to stop the greatest financial crisis the country had ever or has ever faced. It was essentially a psychological problem. And when we think about money, I think yesterday I mentioned something, if you have all this money on a desert island, we can do something more tangible. We can pass around 500 euro notes to everybody, and here's your reward for listening and cooperating, and we'll give more for the best performance. And then when we say, oh, by the way, it's counterfeit, as soon as you think that it's counterfeit, you can start making notes on it or using it for scrap paper or anything else. It doesn't matter whether it's a real note or not. If people believe it's counterfeit, it's valueless. On the contrary, if I pass around the counterfeit notes that we're printing in the academy, and you think it's real, it is, and as long as people think it's real, it's absolutely the same. So, I mean, this is an obvious example of the fact that we think money is something very tangible, very material, very concrete and objective, and we can count it in everything. But we saw in the international financial crisis in 2008, trillions of dollars disappeared overnight simply because of what? No material change, essentially. Perceptions changed, attitudes, expectations changed. So I think this is something, we have a lot of social scientists and students of social science here in the room, and Mario was talking about brand and how Red Bull built this world-famous brand, and I would argue that's exactly what Apple did. That's what Steve Jobs did. That was the significance of that 1984. Apple was not essentially a physical product. It was essentially a psychological phenomenon he was selling. So how important it is for us. Chandrasekharan narrated a brief history of the development of science, and out of practical necessity, when you want to create something we can all agree on, we start studying objects that you can study with the senses and all. But our science today is a science of complex human beings with ideas and emotions, the things we're trying to grapple with. And yet, in psychology, I don't say this is entirely true, but there's a strong effort in psychology to reduce psychology back to material phenomena. I mean, neuroscience is based on that. So I think we need to bring out and make very explicit this issue of trying to deal with the subjective phenomenon by means that are appropriate for dealing with subjectivity, and not just trying to reduce it to its objective behavioral or structural dimensions. So I think this is a very important topic for us and for the work of carrying this program further.